welcome to the video. If you are new around here, don't forget to red subscribe button down below, thumbs up, click the notification bell to always on, and let's get into the video. Don't mind the smoke, it's all good. Welcome back to a new thing we're doing, the Supernatural series. Dive into the whole supernatural world with me as we go exploring through the realms and worlds of witches, werewolves, vampires, everything and anything you can imagine. Come join me as we go into the supernatural realms. This nice community that we're building, and don't forget, I'm going to put the next week's preview. It's going to be right after this. Do you hear that? I hear something. Could it be the famous werewolf? Oh, here it comes. I better get out of here before it actually sees me. Ladies and gentlemen, I come to you from the one and only Werewolf Nation. And yes, that's right, we're going to be talking about werewolves, but not only that, we're going to be also getting into the folklore, because werewolves are kind of that thing that we kind of made up along the road, and it just led gas to the fire that became known as werewolf, and no one other than Hollywood dreamt that this little story from Europe would blossom into this worldwide phenomenon known as werewolves. In folklore, a werewolf or lycanthrope is the human ability to shapeshift into a wolf, or especially in modern film, lycanthropic hybrid wolf creature. Like, people has confused that the werewolf has been synonymous with Sasquatch, but they are two completely different things. After being placed under a curse or affliction, often a bite or scratch from another werewolf, with the transformation occurring on the night of a full moon. It can either be a full moon or a new moon, because we see both of those have been synonymous with having the full sphere of the moon itself. Widespread concept in Europe for folklore, existing in many variations, which are related by a common development of a Christian interpretation of underlying European folklore, developed during the medieval period. From the early modern period, werewolf beliefs also spread to the New World with colonialism. Belief in werewolves were developed in parallel to belief in witches. You have facts that witches have been before even Christ's age, and now you have werewolf, but werewolves are not the little things that go bump the night. Like, they are the lesser known things, because you have witches, vampires, and werewolves. And werewolves are they're like the little red stepchild that no one really wants around, but they're there. Beliefs in werewolves were developed in parallel to belief in witches. In the course of late Middle Ages and the early modern period, like the witchcraft trials as a whole, there were also the trials that exposed the werewolves itself. It emerged in what is now Switzerland in the early 15th century, spread throughout Europe in the 16th century, peaking in the 17th and ending by the 18th century. The persecution of werewolves and the associated folklore is an integral part of the witch hunt phenomenon, albeit a marginal one, accusation of lycanthropy being involved in only a small fraction of the witch trials itself. During the early periods, accusations of lycanthropy, case of Peter Stump, led a significant peak in both interest and the persecution of supposed werewolves, primarily in French-speaking and German-speaking Europe. The phenomenon persisted longest in the Bavarian and Austria, with the persecution of wolf charmers recorded until well after 1650. The final cases taking place in the early 18th century. That's why you have like the stories of the Grimm brothers, that they deal with everything supernatural, and one of the things they deal with is the werewolves. And it wasn't until like the 17th century that these stories start to come out, because you had the Black Forest, that it was so mysterious and everyone wanted to know what was happening in that Black Forest. And then you had the Grimm fairy tales that they're not the Grimm fairy tales that you tell your children at night. No, these stories are different, because if you read the real Grimm fairy tales, you wouldn't be telling that to anyone. After the end of the witch trials, the werewolves became of interest in folklore studies and emerging Gothic horror genre. Werewolf fiction, a genre has pre-modern precedents in medieval romances, and developed in the 18th century of the semi-fictional chapbook tradition. The trappings of horror literature in the 20th century became part of the horror and fantasy of modern popular culture. A few references to men changing into wolves are found in ancient Greek heritage and mythology. Herodotus, in his histories, wrote that the Nerea tribe he placed to the northeast, back to the human of the northeast of Scythia, were all transformed into wolves once every year for several days, and then changed back into their humanoid shapes. This tale was also mentioned by Pomponius Mela. Here is evidence of widespread belief in werewolves in medieval Europe. The evidence spans much of the continent as well as the British Isles. Werewolves were mentioned in medieval law codes such as the King's Celestial Ordinances, informed us to the codes that aim to ensure that the madly audacious werewolf do not too widely devastate, nor bite too many of the spiritual flock. Works of Augustine of Hippo had a large influence on the development of Western Christianity. The works of Augustine of Hippo had a large influence on the development of Western Christianity and were widely read by churchmen of the medieval period. And those churchmen occasionally discuss werewolves in their works. Famous examples include Gerald of Wells' Werewolf of Ossor, found in Topographica Hibernica, and the Gravellies of Tilbury's Otia Imperiala, both written for royal audiences. The Germanic pagan tradition associated with wolfmen persisted longest in the Scandinavian Viking Age. Harold I of Norway is known to have had a body of a wolf-coated man, which are mentioned in the I don't butcher this, Fensodea Saga Haraldskavio and the Volsanaga Saga, and resemble some werewolf legends. The Alfandar were fighters similar to the berserkers, though they dressed in wolf hides rather than those of bears, and were reputed to channel the spirits of these animals to enhance their effectiveness in battle. These warriors were resistant to pain and killed viciously in battle, much like wild animals. and berserkers are closely associated with the Norse god Odin. The Scandinavian traditions of this period has spread to Kievan, Russia, giving rise to the Slavic werewolf tales. And back then in the Scandinavian times, like, all you did was you either went to battle and drank beer and just slept with women. That's basically the main three things you did. And like, if you weren't doing that, in their eyes, in the culture of their eyes, that you weren't a man in that aspect. Werewolfery has a common accusation in witch trials throughout their history, and it is featured even in the Valhalla witch trials, one of the earliest witch trials altogether, and the first of the peak of attention to lycanthropy came in the late 16th century to early 17th century. As part of European witch hunts, a number of treatises on werewolves were written in France during 1595 and 1650. Werewolves were cited in 1598 in Anjou, and a teenage werewolf was sentenced to life imprisonment in Bordeaux in France in 1603. Henry Boguet wrote in a lengthy chapter about werewolves pasture in 1653, werewolves in 1602, and the Vaud werewolves were convicted in 1602 and 1624. A treaty by a Vaud pastor in 1653, however, argued that lycanthropy was purely an illusion. After this, the only further record from the Vaud dates to 1670 is that of a boy who claimed he and his mother could change themselves into wolves, which was however not taken seriously at the beginning of the 17th century. Witchcraft was prosecuted by James I of England, who regarded werewolves, and they spelled it different because it was Warwoofle, not how we pronounce it now, as victims of delusional induced by a natural superabundance of melancholic. After 1650, belief in lycanthropy had most disappeared from French-speaking Europe, as evidence in Diderot's encyclopedia, which attributed reports of lycanthropy to a disorder of the brain, although they were continuing reports of extraordinary wolf-like beasts, but not werewolves. On such report that the beasts of Gallivant, which terrorized the general areas of the former province of Gallivant, called Lozère, and south-central France. From the year 1764 to 1767, it killed upwards of 80 men, women, and children. The part of Europe which showed more vigorous interest in werewolves after 1650 was the Holy Roman Empire. At least 9 works of lycanthropy were printed in Germany between 1649 and 1679. In the Austrian and Bavarian Alps, belief in werewolves persisted well into the 18th century, in any case as late as in 1853 in Galicia, northwestern Spain. Manuel Blanco Romasada was judged and condemned as the author of a number of murders, but he claimed to be not guilty because him condition of Lobichon, werewolf. Until the 20th century, wolf attacks on humans were an occasional but still widespread feature of life in Europe. Some scholars have suggested that it was the inevitable that wolves, being the most feared predators in Europe, were projected into a folklore of evil shapeshifters, which we'll be getting into the lore of shapeshifters later on, because werewolves and shapeshifters, it's completely different opposites. This is said to be corroborated by the fact that areas devoid of wolves typically use different kinds of predators to fill the niche. werehemmas in Africa, were-tigers in India, as well as were-pumas in South America. Now, let's get into the beliefs. The beliefs of the werewolves itself, because if you think about being a werewolf, it's kind of genius, because not only do you have the heightened smell, the heightened hearing, and you can like run fast as hell. Beliefs classed together under lycanthropy are far from uniform, and the term is somewhat capriciously applied. The transformation may be temporary or permanent. The were-animal may be the man himself metamorphosed, may be his double whose activity leaves the real man to all appearance unchanged, and may be his soul which goes forth seeking whoever it may devour, leaving its body in a state of trance, or it may be no more than the messenger of the human being, a real animal or familiar spirit. Or it may be no more than the messenger of the human being, a real animal or a familiar spirit, whose intimate connection with its owner is shown by the fact that any injury that is believed by a phenomenon known as repercussion to cause a corresponding injury to a human being. Werewolves were said in Europe folklore to bear the tell-all physical traits even in their human form. This include the meeting of both eyebrows, which we call now the unibrow, at the bridge of the nose, curved fingernails, low seat ears, and a swinging stride. One method of identifying a werewolf in its human form was to cut the flesh of the accused, under the pretense that fur would be seen within the wound. A Russian superstition recalls a werewolf can be recognized by bristles under the tongue. Appearance of a werewolf in its animal form varies from culture to culture, though it is most commonly portrayed as being indistinguished from ordinary wolves, save for the fact that it has no tail, a trait that characteristics of witches in animal form. Is often larger and retains human eyes and a voice. According to some Swedish accounts, the werewolves could be distinguished from a regular wolf in the fact that it would run on 3 legs, stretching the 4th one backwards to look like a tail. After returning to their human forms, werewolves are one backwards to look like a tail. After returning to their human forms, werewolves are usually documented as becoming weak, debilitated, and undergoing painful nervous depression. One universal revealed trait in the medieval Europe is that the werewolf's habit of devouring recently buried corpse, a trait that is documented extensively, particularly in the Annals Medico-Physiological in the 19th century. Various methods for becoming a werewolf have been reported, one of the simplest being of the removal of clothing and putting on a belt made of wolf skin, probably a substitute for assumption of the entire animal skin, which also is frequently described in other cases. The body is rubbed with a magic salve, drinking rainwater and out of the footprint of the animal in question, or from the certain enchanted streams, were also considered effective modes of accomplishment of metamorphosis, which means basically the changing of the human body into something else. The 16th century Swedish writer Olaus Magnus says that the Livonian werewolves were initiated by draining a cup of specifically prepared beer and repeating a set formula. Ralston, in his Songs of Russia People, gives the form of an incantation still familiar to Russia. In Italy, France and Germany, it was said that a man or a woman could turn into werewolf if he or she, on a certain Wednesday or Friday, slept outside on a summer night with the full moon shining directly into his or her face. The curse of lycanthropy was also considered by some scholars as being a divine punishment. Werewolf literature shows many examples of gods or saints allegedly cursing those who invoke the wrath with lycanthropy, such as in the case of Lycaon, who was turned into a wolf by Zeus as punishment for slaughtering one of his own sons and serving his remains to the gods at dinner. Those who were excommunicated by the Roman Catholic Church were also said to become werewolves. The power of transforming others into wild beasts was attributed not only to malignant sorcerers, but to Christian saints as well. Omnis angeli bone et male, ex virtue naturally habent posterium, transmutandi corpa nostra. It means all angels, good and bad, have the power of transmutating our bodies. With the dictum of St. Thomas Aquinas, St. Patrick was said to have transformed the Welsh king Verdicus into a wolf. Nautilus supposedly cursed an illustrious Irish family whose members were each doomed to be a wolf for 7 years. In other tales, the dive agency is even more direct. While in Russia, again, men supposedly become werewolves while incurring the wrath of the devil himself. We all know the remedies for getting rid of a werewolf. You either have wolfsbane, which if a wolf eats it, there's some properties in it that is poisonous to the wolf, it can actually die. And then you have the silver bullet or a silver knife to the heart. That can usually kill a wolf. So let's get into the remedies of being a werewolf. Various methods have existed for removing the werewolf form. In antiquity, the ancient Greeks and Romans believed that the power of exhaustion in curing people of lycanthropy, the victim would be subject to long periods of physical activity in the hope of being purged of the malady. This practice stemmed from the fact that many alleged werewolves would be left feeling weak and debilitated after committing depredations. In medieval Europe, traditionally, there are 3 methods one can use to cure a victim of lycanthropy. Medieval, usually via the use of wolfsbane, which we already touched on, surgically or by exorcism. However, many of the cures advocated by the medieval medical practitioners proved fatal to the patients. A Sicilian belief of Arabic origin holds that the werewolf can be cured of its alignment by striking it on the forehead or the scalp with a knife. Another belief from the same culture involves the piercing of the werewolf hands with nails. Sometimes less extreme methods were used. In the German lowland of Schleswig-Holstein, a werewolf could be cured if one were to simply address it 3 times by a Christian name, while one Danish belief holds that merely scolding a werewolf would cure it. I mean, like, that's just crazy if you think about it, because how would you cure a person by scolding it 3 times? Like, come on. Conversion to Christianity is also a common method of removing lycanthropy in the medieval period. A devotion to Saint Hubert himself has also been cited as both cure and protection from lycanthropy. Most modern fiction describes werewolves as vulnerable to silver and weapons and highly resistant to other injuries. This feature appears in German folklore of the 19th century. The claim that the beast of gallivant, an 18th century wolf or wolf-like creature, was shot by a silver bullet, appears to have been introduced by novelists retelling the story from 1935 onwards and not in earlier versions. English folklore prior to 1865 showed shapeshifters to be vulnerable to silver, till the publication shot a silver button over their heads when they were instantly transformed into two ill-favored old ladies. In 1640, the city of Greifswald, Germany, was infested by werewolves. A clever lad suggested that they gather all the silver buttons, goblets, belt buckles, and so forth, and melt them down into their own bullets for their muskets and pistols. This time they slaughtered the creatures and rid Griswold of the lycanthropy. Werewolves were often depicted as immune to damages caused by ordinary weapons, being vulnerable only to silver objects such as a silver-tipped cane, bullet, or blade. This attribute was first adopted cinematically in The Wolfman. This negative reaction to silver is sometimes so strong that the mere touch of the metal on a werewolf skin can cause it to burn. Current day werewolf fictions almost exclusively involves lycanthropy being either a heredity condition or being transmitted like an infectious disease by the bite of another werewolf or a scratch by another werewolf. In some fiction, the power of the werewolf extends to human form, such as invulnerability to the conventional injury due to the healing factor, superhuman speed and strength, and falling on their feet from their hind legs from high falls. Also, aggressiveness and animalistic urges may be intensified and more difficult to control. Hunger, sexual arousal. Usually in these cases, the abilities are diminished to the human form. In other fiction, it can be cured by medicine or antidotes. Along with vulnerability, the silver bullet, the full moon being the cause of the transformation, only became part of the depiction of werewolves on a widespread basis in the 20th century. The first movie ever to feature the transformation effect of the full moon was Frankenstein Meets the Wolfman in 1943. And many believe that it was basically a curse put on by gypsies and witches to these people that basically slaughtered the relatives of these gypsies and witches. But we can only speculate because we weren't there. And like, if I see a werewolf, I'm hightailing it out of there, because it can outspeed you. And if you even hear the howl of a wolf, you be sure to get out of there, because although it sounds cool to have heightened hearing, smelling, and speed, the cracking, when you transform into a werewolf, it's like your bones are cracking each one by one until the body can't do it. And while you're in that transformation, you're in so excruciating pain that your body just passes out, and then you wake up as a wolf. And when you transform back into human, most of the time you can't remember what happened. I wouldn't even wish that on my worst enemy. Thank you all for joining me. Be sure, if you like this video, hit the red subscribe button down below, the thumbs up, click the notification bell to always on. Hitting a like lets us reach more audience and gets more viewers into